Welcome to the Retire with Peace podcast, the podcast where we help you create a fulfilling and stress-free retirement. Each week, we bring you expert advice, practical tips, and inspiring stories to help you plan and live your best retirement life. Whether you're nearing retirement or already enjoying your golden years, this podcast is here to support you every step of the way. Let's embark on this journey together and discover how to retire with peace.
Welcome back to the Retire with Peace podcast. As always, I'm your host, Dave Zaegel. Today, let's talk about bonds and structured notes because we've been getting questions about, hey, what the heck are these things? You talk about them all the time, but we don't really understand what they are. So let's back up a little bit on that. Instead of diving way into strategy, let's get back to some fundamentals of what are bonds and what are structured notes. We did have some previous episodes on this a long time ago. I think it was episodes 10 and 18, if I recall correctly, somewhere in the ballpark on those. And we'll put links to those in the show notes here. The bonds and structured notes are really important because, as those of you who listen to our podcast all the time know, that I'm a broken record on having at least 5 years in bonds or structured notes or cash, some combination thereof, because those are going to provide set income for at least 5 years and allow the rest of your investments to just grow long term. So that way you don't have to worry about all the ups and downs in the stock market and all this other stuff. And oh my gosh, the stock market's down and now I'm pulling money out for income. None of that. None of that's a concern because we can let all that grow long term if we have at least 5 years in bonds, structured notes, cash, CDs at a bank, something that is just really safe, not invested in the stock market. And we know that we're going to have income from that no matter what happens in the stock market or with tax rates and all this other stuff. We just know that we have the guaranteed income. So first, let's tackle bonds. So a bond is a debt instrument, which is just a fancy way of saying you are providing somebody else with money. They are going to pay you back in the future. And while you wait for that repayment, they are going to be paying you interest, generally every 6 months. So it could be the US government. It could be a major corporation like Apple or Microsoft. It could be a bank like Citibank or Bank of America, Morgan Stanley, you name it, Wells Fargo, any major bank. You're lending them money. And again, they're going to pay you back at some predetermined point. That's when the bond matures. And every 6 months, they're going to send you interest payments along the way. Now, I get it. There are some treasuries that are zero interest payments, but you get to buy them at a discount. We're not going to go through all that. But just know that you have a guaranteed payment from them at the end of the term. And that is really the critical piece where we want to make sure that we are matching up that payment that we are receiving back with the income that we are going to need for the next 5 years. So you'll see bonds, individual bonds that are spread out over 5-year periods to provide us income along the way. So what happens is, let's say you're going to give Apple $10,000. You lend them $10,000. They're going to pay you back a little bit of interest. I don't know what they're at right now. Let's say it's a 5-year term. So 5 years from now, they're going to give you your $10,000 back, but they're going to pay you probably 2 or 3% interest along the way, which is nothing earth-shattering, but it's at least something that you're getting paid back over time. But the key is that we want to know that we're going to get paid back the money when we need it for income. That's really the big key because the rest of the investments are growing. They're doing awesome. Long-term focus. We're really trying to set up income along the way. Now, right now, U.S. Treasuries are actually paying out some great rates. So we probably wouldn't look at that Apple bond of 2 or 3% as being all that amazing. And I don't quote me on the 2 or 3%. I don't have that in front of me. I'm just using it as an example. But instead of that, you might say, well, wow, this U.S. Treasury guaranteed by the government, they're paying out 4%. Let's just do that instead. And I couldn't really blame you. Now, both Apple, I believe Apple is a AAA rated, but both of them are probably going to be very similarly rated because Apple's in such good financial shape. And so I want to bring up that because when we look at bonds, there's going to be a special emphasis on bond quality. There's different rating agencies, but just think of it in terms of going from AAA at the highest down to C, and I don't even know how low it goes. I don't even bother with it way down there. But we're going to go from AAA up top to AA to A to double B, or excuse me, triple B to double B to single B, and then you get into the C's, and that's not even worth looking at, honestly, for what we're talking about, because we want to stay at least investment grade. And investment grade is considered anything that is triple B or higher. I don't even tend to go down to triple B for this because I want safety. We want to know that we are getting our money back. That is the key. The interest rate is less important. It's not unimportant, but it's less important than making sure we get the money back. So a lot of times we're looking at US Treasuries because they're AAA. We're looking at other companies that are AAA, some that are AA. Maybe we'll get down to single A, maybe. But we are really looking for a high quality. We want our money back. And yes, we'll take some interest along the way. If it's a couple percent, of course, that's awesome. But we want to know that we're going to get our money back for income in these early years, or really the next 5 years of our retirement. Again, that's a huge benefit because it lets everything else grow. We don't have to touch it. We don't have to worry about what the stock market's doing next week, next month, next year. That is for the long term. So we have that bucket set. And in the meantime, we have these bonds and structured notes that are giving us guaranteed payments back on time when we need them for our income. But that's the basics on bonds. You're lending out the money, you have it get sent back to you on a certain date, which is the maturity date, and you're making some interest income along the way. Let's pivot over to structured notes, which we use as a bond alternative. It's not quite the same thing, but given that there can be some guarantees with it, they can be really helpful. Now, with structured notes, we keep it simple. There are all varieties of structured notes. And what structured notes are is they kind of are what they say. There is a bank or an insurance company that is putting out a note with a certain structure, and it's guaranteed by that bank or by that insurance institution. Now, the nice thing is it doesn't work like a bond where you're getting set interest payments back. Some can, some do. Most don't. But you can have some structured notes that are more focused on growth. We don't use those quite as much because we're just using our stock investments for that growth piece. Where we use structured notes are ones where they have some guaranteed floors underneath. So a lot of times the bank or the insurance company will say, you give us X dollars. Let's use $10,000 because it can be the same example. You give us $10,000. We are going to guarantee a floor. So that way, over the next X number of years, it could be 1 year, 3 years, 2 years, 5 years. They're going to set these terms up front and say, we're going to provide this floor where if you leave the money in there, we, the bank, or we, the insurance company, are going to guarantee this floor. In the meantime, you're going to get gains that are tied to a index or a stock or a couple of stocks combined together. Again, we prefer to keep this simple. So a lot of times we're using the S&P 500 or an individual stock. But in this case, they say you're going to get the growth of this fund or of this stock up to a cap because they're using that cap to pay for their floor, essentially. But you can get some really good potential growth from this investment, all while still having this floor underneath and a set maturity date when you will get the money back from the investment. Again, that's the key. We at least want our money back for this income. If we can get some interest income from the bonds or some extra growth from the structured notes, awesome. But the reason we use these as bond alternatives is because we could potentially get a little bit higher return if that stock or if that fund that the structured note is tied to does really well over that period. It could be worse. It could be the bond actually makes more interest income if the stock doesn't do well. That's always a possibility. But you're taking the bet that we think this fund or this stock is going to do better than the interest income we could be receiving. And we still have this critical floor and a maturity date where we will get our money back. So again, I keep it simple. There's all sorts of different structured note structures. Doesn't mean they're bad. It's just you have to know what the goal is. That's really the point. Is our goal is guarantee, get the money back, try to make some extra return by using the structured note, not getting fancy. That's not the point. We don't get fancy with retirement money. That's ridiculous. We want to know for at least 5 years, we got these bonds or these structured notes that will provide us the income. We can let the rest of the stock-focused money grow over the long term, and it works extremely well every time. Whether the market's up, the market's down, we know we've got our income. We know we're focused on long-term growth. It provides a spectacular result. But that is the primer on bonds and structured notes. That way, now when we talk about them in the future, you can say, oh, I know how bonds work. That makes sense. Oh, I know how structured note works. That makes sense. And one more thing I'll add, we tend to use individual bonds and not bond funds. It's not that bond funds can't work. They've worked for a long time. They had a great run for several decades. The challenge with bond funds, in my view, is that there's not a set maturity date. And these funds aren't necessarily holding all of these to maturity. So what happens is when interest rates move, the value of the bond funds also moves. Now, the value of individual bonds move as well, but we know that this bond has a set maturity value on a set date. So even if there's fluctuations in between, we know we're going to get X dollars back when it matures. We can't guarantee that with bond funds. It could be higher, it could be lower. Now, somebody might say, hey, we have the opportunity for higher. True. And like I said, for several decades, the 80s, 90s, and onward, that was the case. Bond funds were fantastic. In a rising interest rate environment, bond funds not so great. When interest rates are falling, bond funds are awesome. So you just have to be mindful that if you're in bond funds, you're not dealing with that same level of guarantee of getting the income back for sure when you need it. All you have to do is rewind back to 2022 when the stock market had a nasty year. And usually bonds are there to like prop us up and say, hey, okay, well, at least got these bond funds. Not that year. Bond funds took a dive too. And that year we were able to tell people this is why we're using individual bonds, not bond funds, because they didn't have that guaranteed value that year that they needed it the most when the stock market was dropping. So again, bond funds are not bad. I want to emphasize that there's nothing wrong with bond funds. We just have to match the tool that we are using to the purpose we're using it for. And in this case, we're looking for guaranteed income for 5 years. We want to make sure that we have investments like bonds and structured notes that have set maturity dates and set amounts that we know we're going to get our money back. Thanks so much for tuning into this episode. I really appreciate your support and hope you found value in the conversation. If you enjoyed it, be sure to subscribe, leave a review, and share it with someone who might benefit from it. Your feedback helps keep the show growing. Until next time, take care and stay strong as we learn